There is a version of the Vanderbilt story that gets told in every American history textbook, every business school lecture, and every documentary about the Gilded Age. It goes like this. A rough, uneducated boy named Cornelius, born to a poor Dutch farming family on Staten Island in 1794, starts ferrying passengers across New York Harbor for $1 a trip. He saves his money. He builds a small fleet. He beats back the steamboat monopoly by sheer stubbornness. He pivots to railroads at exactly the right moment, acquires the New York Central, and dies in 1877, leaving behind $100 million, the largest private fortune ever accumulated in the United States to that point, a self-made man, the American dream in its purest form. But there are 4 generations of Vanderbilts that this story never mentions, 4 generations that appear in genealogical records and then disappear. 4 generations during a period of history when the map of the world looked radically different from what we are shown in school. 4 generations whose origins connect to a landmass and a civilization that the official academic record insists never existed. And when you trace those 4 generations backward, when you follow the paper trail into archives that most researchers never bother to open, you find something that fundamentally changes the story of where the Vanderbilt fortune actually came from. The name Vanderbilt itself is the first clue. It is not a name. It is a location. Vanderbilt, from the Bilt, refers to a place called De Bilt, a village in the province of Utrecht in what is now the Netherlands. The prefix van in Dutch genealogy indicates origin. The family came from that place. But when you try to trace who lived at De Bilt before the 17th century, when you push past the family's acknowledged immigration date and look at what the Dutch colonial archives actually say about the Bilt region in the 1600s, you encounter a recurring problem. The records don't go back far enough. They go back to a certain point and then stop, as if someone took a pair of scissors to the genealogical thread at a very specific moment in time. The acknowledged patriarch of the American branch is Jan Aertszoon Vanderbilt, who emigrated from the Netherlands to New Amsterdam, present-day New York, sometime around 1650. That is the official starting point. That is where the family tree, according to every genealogical database and every Vanderbilt family history ever published, begins. Jan arrives, Jan has children. 4 generations later, Cornelius is born on May 27, 1794, and the story of American capitalism begins. What they do not tell you is that Jan Aertszoon's own origins are entirely undocumented. What they do not tell you is that the period between Jan's supposed departure and the establishment of New Amsterdam was one of the most geopolitically chaotic periods in European history, a period during which enormous quantities of wealth were being transferred, concealed, and relabeled across the continent. And what they absolutely do not tell you is that the region Jan came from, the Utrecht province and the broader Low Countries, sat on the western edge of a territory that appeared on virtually every major European map produced between 1500 and 1800 as one of the most powerful political entities in the known world. That entity was called Tartaria, or, in its fuller designation, Grand Tartary, Magnum Tartaria, the Great Tartarian Empire. Before you dismiss that name, go do something simple. Pull up the maps produced by Willem Bleeuw in 1635. Pull up the Carte de Tartary produced by Guillaume de Lille in 1706. Pull up the maps in the 1770 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Look at Asia. Look at what is labelled there. Not a void. Not a question mark. A nation. A named, bordered, mapped nation occupying the entire interior of the Eurasian continent from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. Labelled with cities. Labelled with rivers and trade routes. Labelled with the names of regional subdivisions, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary. This territory appears on hundreds of maps produced by the most respected cartographers in European history. And then, in maps produced after approximately 1860, it vanishes, not reorganized, not renamed, gone. The standard academic explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified empire. It was a geographic descriptor, a cartographic convention used by Europeans to refer to vaguely understood regions east of Moscow. The maps were not accurate. They were based on rumour and traveller accounts and were progressively corrected as European knowledge of the region improved. By the mid-1800s, accurate survey data replaced the old labels, and Tartaria disappeared from maps because it had never truly existed as a political entity. That explanation has a significant problem. The maps that supposedly reflected European ignorance of Central Asia were produced by cartographers who were simultaneously producing extraordinarily accurate maps of coastlines, trade routes, and cities across the rest of the world. The same Blau who supposedly invented the fictional Tartarian nation out of ignorance was the official cartographer of the Dutch East India Company, an organization whose entire business depended on geographic accuracy. The argument that European cartographers were sophisticated enough to accurately chart the coastlines of Africa and the Americas, but were simultaneously making up an entire continent-spanning empire in the interior of Asia, does not survive scrutiny. There is another explanation, one that the academic establishment has not formally engaged with, because engaging with it would require reopening questions that were closed a long time ago for reasons that had nothing to do with scholarship. The other explanation is that Tartaria was real, that it was a functioning civilization with cities, infrastructure, trade networks, and a sophisticated system of resource distribution. That something happened to it, a catastrophic event, a war, a series of deliberate destructions, sometime in the late 1700s to mid-1800s. And that the world the Vanderbilts operated in was not built from scratch on empty land, but was built on top of the ruins of something that had been erased from the record, something that had left behind infrastructure, wealth, and bloodlines that certain families were very careful to inherit without acknowledging what they were inheriting. The timeline matters here. The Great Reset hypothesis and the idea that a major civilizational collapse occurred sometime between 1700 and 1850, leaving behind a depopulated and restructured world, is not the invention of internet forums. It is the conclusion reached independently by a growing number of researchers who have examined the same set of anomalies from different angles and arrived at the same general picture. The architectural record, the Tartarian mud flood evidence preserved in photographs of buildings excavated from ground level in cities across North America and Europe. The extraordinary speed with which major infrastructure projects were supposedly built during the 1800s using labour pools and engineering knowledge that should not have existed at the scale recorded. The World's Fair buildings constructed in months that would take years today. The canal systems and railroad grades that follow routes which, on examination, appear older than the men credited with commissioning them. That last point is where the Vanderbilt story becomes specifically relevant. When Cornelius Vanderbilt began acquiring railroad properties in the 1860s, he was not building railroads, he was acquiring them. He bought the New York and Harlem Railroad in 1862. He bought the Hudson River Railroad in 1864. He bought the New York Central in 1867. The narrative presents this as a genius recognizing the future and consolidating the industry. But look at what he was actually buying. He was buying rights of way. He was buying the authority to use track that already existed. He was buying the legal framework that said, this corridor through this terrain belongs to this entity, and you now own that entity. Where did those corridors come from? The official history says they were surveyed and built by the railroad companies themselves in the 1840s and 1850s. But the surveys for the New York Central route, the corridor running from New York City to Albany and then west through the Mohawk Valley, follow a path that is extraordinarily precise for the terrain. The Mohawk Valley corridor in particular hugs the contour of the land in a way that suggests it was not chosen by surveyors standing at ground level in the 1840s, but was instead the continuation of a route that had been travelled for much longer. The grades are gentle, the drainage is considered. The alignments avoid obstacles in ways that require knowledge of the territory beyond what a mid-century survey crew working in a few months could reasonably be expected to develop. Researchers examining railroad development across the United States have consistently identified a pattern in which the supposedly new rights of way follow older paths paths documented in maps that predate the railroads by decades, paths that appear on certain European maps of North America, showing interior infrastructure that, according to the official record, should not have existed yet. Those networks correspond, with uncomfortable frequency, to exactly the corridors that the railroad barons of the Gilded Age would later acquire, consolidate, and profit from. Cornelius Vanderbilt did not build those routes. He bought the rights to routes that already had a history that was being systematically obscured at the same time that men like Cornelius were being elevated as the self-made originators of American commerce. Now, go back 4 generations. Back past Cornelius, past his father and grandfather, past the Staten Island farmstead and the ferry business, past the New Amsterdam landing of Jan Erzoon Vanderbilt in 1650. Go back to the De Bilt village in Utrecht that the family name references, and look at what Utrecht was in the early 1600s. Utrecht was not simply a modest Dutch farming province. It was a major centre of the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, one of the wealthiest polities on earth during that period. A republic whose global trade network extended from the Hudson Valley to the Cape of Good Hope to the Spice Islands. The Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602, and Utrecht province provided significant capital and merchant families to that enterprise. The Dutch were, at that moment, the premier mapping and charting civilization in the world. They were also the civilization most consistently in contact with, and most consistently relabeling, the eastern regions of the Eurasian landmass on their maps. If Tartaria was real, if there was a network of infrastructure, trade, and accumulated resource that the Dutch merchant class was interacting with through their eastern trade routes, if certain Dutch families had made specific arrangements with Tartarian representatives, arrangements that transferred wealth or knowledge into Dutch hands during the chaotic period of the late 1500s and early 1600s. Then it would make sense that a family from Utrecht would carry that inheritance westward to the New World. It would make sense that the 4 generations between Jan and Cornelius were not simply accumulating wealth through farming and ferrying, but were custodying something, holding something in reserve, maintaining a network, waiting for the right historical moment to bring it into the open. The problem with proving any of this through conventional genealogical research is that the records for those 4 generations are extraordinarily sparse. Historians of the Vanderbilt family have noted this. The family's own authorized biographies acknowledge the thin documentation covering the period between Jan's arrival and Cornelius's father's generation. This is sometimes attributed to the record-keeping limitations of colonial America. Paper was scarce. Record offices were inconsistent. Fires destroyed documents. All of that is true. But the sparseness of Vanderbilt records from this period is particularly striking when compared to other Dutch colonial families of similar social standing in New Amsterdam, whose records survived in substantially more complete form. The Roosevelts, the Schuylers, the Van Cortlandts, their genealogical trails are considerably easier to follow through the same period. The question worth asking is not simply what happened to the records. The question is whether those 4 generations were operating in a way that made record creation undesirable. Whether the business of those 4 generations was the kind of business that people conducting it would have preferred not to document in detail. There is one more thread here that deserves attention, and it concerns the physical world that Cornelius Vanderbilt chose to stamp his name on. The Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue, Vanderbilt University in Nashville, the Breakers in Newport, Grand Central Terminal in New York. These buildings are remarkable for many reasons, but there is one consistent characteristic of Vanderbilt-associated architecture, and of the Gilded Age architecture broadly, that the revisionist record has been quietly documenting for years: the style, the specific combination of elements, the arched windows, the enormous interior volumes, the elaborate stonework, the towers and domes, the attention to acoustic and structural principles that mainstream architecture of the supposed period could not have spontaneously generated from scratch. Researchers in the Tartarian architecture community have identified what they call the Old World building style, a consistent architectural language appearing across ostensibly unconnected cultures and time periods. from the supposed ruins of Tartarian cities in Central Asia to the buildings of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, to the major train stations and civic buildings constructed across America during the Gilded Age. The argument is not that the Vanderbilts consciously built in a Tartarian style as tribute. The argument is more unsettling. The argument is that certain buildings from this period were not built by the people credited with building them. That Grand Central Terminal, whose construction the official record dates to 1903 through 1913, incorporates structural and aesthetic elements suggesting a different origin. That the Vanderbilts and the other industrial families of the period were not commissioning the construction of new infrastructure, but were inheriting existing structures and conducting the public theatre of commissioning them as a way of establishing legal ownership and historical credit. The World's Fairs of the late 1800s make this argument most acute. The 1893 Chicago Fair, the White City, was supposedly constructed in under 2 years by a workforce that contemporaneous accounts describe as exhausted and underpaid. The result was a complex of buildings that architectural historians consistently describe as among the most accomplished ever produced in America. Massive domed structures, perfectly proportioned colonnades, acres of elaborately finished facades, all built in less time than it takes to construct a modest apartment building today. And then, at the fair's conclusion, deliberately demolished. Why would the most architecturally sophisticated construction project in American history be deliberately torn down? The official answer is that the buildings were made of plaster and wood and were not meant to be permanent. But photographs of the demolition crews show men using tools to break apart structures that appear to be made of stone. And the buildings that survived from the White City era, later classified as permanent, show construction techniques and material compositions inconsistent with 1890s American building methods. Grand Central Terminal is a particularly instructive case. The station that stands today replaced the original Grand Central Depot built in 1871. But that 1871 depot itself replaced a structure on the same site. The terminal as it exists today has basement levels that, by the official account, were excavated for the 1903 construction project. But structural engineers who have examined those lower levels have noted that the material composition and construction techniques of the deepest sections do not match what would be expected from a turn-of-the-century excavation. They match something older, something built before the ground level above them was established at its current elevation. Ground level elevation is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the central pieces of physical evidence in the Tartarian reset argument. Across cities in North America and Europe, there are buildings whose ground floors, by the measurement of when they were supposedly built, are now partially or fully below the current street level. The standard explanation is that streets were raised for drainage and infrastructure purposes over the course of the 19th century. This is true in many documented cases, but the extent of the raising and the consistency of the phenomenon across cities that were not in communication with each other about their street raising projects suggests something larger, suggests a deposit event, a layer of material that arrived across a wide geographic area at roughly the same time, a layer that buried the lower portions of buildings that were standing when it arrived, a layer above which the official record of the 19th century was then constructed, and below which the physical evidence of whatever was there before remained, preserved but inaccessible. If you accept the possibility that such a deposit event occurred, if you accept that the world in which Cornelius Vanderbilt launched his ferry business was a world still recovering from a catastrophic event that had depopulated large areas, destroyed or buried significant infrastructure, and left behind enormous quantities of unclaimed resource in the form of land, buildings, trade route rights, and accumulated wealth with no surviving owners to contest its acquisition, then the speed of the Vanderbilt fortune building becomes less miraculous and more explicable. You are not watching a man build an empire from nothing. You are watching a man with the right genealogical connections, the right inherited knowledge, and the right timing move into a landscape of unclaimed inheritance and establish legal title over it before anyone else could organize to contest his claim. The Staten Island Ferry is, in this reading, not the humble origin story. It is the public cover story, a narrative of modest beginnings that explains the presence of capital without requiring an explanation of where that capital actually came from. In 1810, when Cornelius was 16 years old and supposedly just beginning his ferrying career, the ferry crossing between Staten Island and Manhattan was already a commercially significant route. The infrastructure supporting that route, the docking facilities, the established customer base, the surveyed channel, did not emerge from Cornelius's initiative. It already existed. The entrepreneurial mythology requires us to believe that he transformed that existing system through sheer ability. But the transformation of a ferry operation into a steamboat empire requires capital that a teenage ferryman earning $1 a trip cannot plausibly accumulate in the time frame the official record provides. Where did the early capital come from? The family biographies say his mother provided the initial funds for his first boat. That explanation is for the ferry, not for the steamboat fleet. The steamboat operations required a different order of investment. The investors who backed the early Vanderbilt steamboat ventures were not random. They were connected to specific financial and mercantile networks operating in New York in the early 1800s. Networks with roots in the Dutch colonial merchant families who had been managing certain inherited resources since the mid-1600s. The same families, the same networks, the same thread connecting back, generation by generation, to a moment before the official record begins. The Livingston monopoly is another instructive episode. In 1808, Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton obtained a monopoly from the New York State Legislature, giving them exclusive rights to operate steamboats in New York waters. This monopoly was extraordinary in its scope. It covered all navigable waters in the state. It charged licensing fees that made competition economically impossible. It was enforced by injunctions and fines. For 17 years, this monopoly controlled steam navigation in the state. Cornelius Vanderbilt entered this environment not as a small operator, quietly building a competing fleet, but as an agent of Thomas Gibbons, a Georgia planter funding a deliberate legal challenge to the Livingston-Fulton monopoly. The Supreme Court case that resulted, Gibbons versus Ogden, decided in 1824, is taught in law schools as foundational Commerce Clause precedent. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the federal government's power to regulate interstate commerce superseded the state-granted monopoly. But the question the standard legal history does not address is, who funded the challenge? The financial networks behind Gibbons and behind the specific legal arguments that prevailed in the Supreme Court trace back to the same interlinked merchant capital networks that appear repeatedly in the genealogy of early American commerce. Networks that have been managing inherited resources since before the official American commercial record begins. When the monopoly fell, Vanderbilt was not one of many competitors who rushed in. He was the primary beneficiary. The speed of that consolidation is, again, the kind of thing that entrepreneurial mythology attributes to personal genius. The alternative explanation is that the consolidation was planned before the legal battle was won, because the people behind it knew the outcome before it was publicly delivered. This is how old money works, not through the dramatic gambits of the individual genius, through the patient management of inherited networks, inherited information, and inherited capital that operates across generations with a consistency that individual lifetimes cannot match. The Vanderbilt story presents Cornelius as the genesis, as the point at which nothing became something. But nothing becomes something from nothing. The fertility that produced the Vanderbilt fortune was in the soil before Cornelius planted anything. And the question of what that soil was made of, when you follow the genealogical thread through the 4 missing generations, through the Dutch colonial merchant networks, through the cartographic record of a civilization that appears on hundreds of European maps and then vanishes, points toward a specific and deeply inconvenient conclusion. The wealth that Cornelius Vanderbilt built was not self-made. It was inherited, not from a named ancestor in the conventional sense, but from a world. A prior civilization whose infrastructure, resources, and trade networks survived the event that erased it from official history, and whose inheritance was quietly distributed among the families that had maintained the right genealogical and financial connections through the catastrophic transition from that world to this one. The Vanderbilts were not builders, they were inheritors. And the thing they inherited had a name. It appeared on every major map of the known world for 300 years. And then, precisely as the families who had inherited its wealth were consolidating that wealth into the visible empires of the Gilded Age, it disappeared from the maps. As if by arrangement, the 4 missing generations are not a genealogical accident. They are a record of the transition, a record of the specific period during which certain families moved from being custodians of an unnamed inheritance to being publicly recognized as self-made American fortunes. The documentation is thin in that period because the documentation was made thin, because the story that replaced it, the story of the humble ferryman, the self-made man, the American dream, was a more useful story. It was a story that made the fortune seem legitimate. It was a story that closed the books on questions about origins by providing an origin so clean that most people never thought to look further. But the maps were real. The cities labelled on them were real. The trade routes were real. The cartographers who drew them were not making things up. And the families who arrived in the New World in the mid-1600s from the regions of Europe most connected to those trade routes did not arrive empty-handed. They arrived with knowledge. They arrived with capital. They arrived with the names of specific corridors, specific routes, specific nodes in an infrastructure network that, when the right historical moment came, could be converted from informal inherited knowledge into legal title, corporate ownership, and dynastic wealth. That moment was the early to mid-1800s. The moment when the reset, whatever it actually was, had progressed far enough that the prior civilization was no longer a political fact to be reckoned with, but only a geographic inheritance to be claimed. The moment when the old routes could be surveyed and the surveys filed as original documents with governments that had no competing record of those routes' prior existence. The moment when a ferryman's son could emerge from a thin genealogical record and a sparse archive, step into a landscape of inherited infrastructure and inherited capital, and be presented to history as the origin of something that had been building for a very long time before he arrived. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 worth $100 million. He gave most of it to his son William, who doubled it within 8 years. The doubling of an already extraordinary fortune in 8 years is either a testament to William's genius, or it is evidence that the infrastructure producing that wealth had not been exhausted by Cornelius's lifetime, that it was still generating returns from a capital base far larger and far older than the official account of a Staten Island ferry boy could accommodate. William's children scattered the fortune across the mansions and social ambitions of the Gilded Age. By the 3rd generation it was mostly gone, dispersed, spent. The infrastructure that had generated it was by then fully incorporated into the public economic system. The railroads consolidated into national networks, the trade routes standardized, the old knowledge embedded in legal and corporate structures that no longer required the custodianship of any particular family. The inheritance had been laundered, converted from the private holding of a specific genealogical network into the public infrastructure of a nation. And the story that accompanied that conversion, the story of self-made genius and entrepreneurial courage, was the story that the conversion required. Because the actual story, the story of a Dutch colonial family carrying an inheritance from a prior civilization through 4 undocumented generations and into the most spectacular private fortune in American history, was a story that raised too many questions. About what that prior civilization was, about what happened to it, about who decided it would be erased from the maps, about who benefits when a civilization disappears from official history and its infrastructure is quietly redistributed among the families with the right connections to claim it. Those questions are still open. The maps are still available in the archives. The genealogical gaps are still there. The architectural anomalies are still present in the stone and steel of buildings that official history says were built by men who could not have built them as quickly or as precisely as the record claims. The grade of the Mohawk Valley corridor is still gentler than it should be for a route supposedly surveyed in the 1840s. The lower levels of Grand Central are still older than the construction project credited with creating them, and the Vanderbilt family tree still has 4 generations that the official genealogies paper over with thin documentation and convenient assumptions. The question is not whether you believe in Tartaria. The question is whether you believe that 300 years of European cartography was a prolonged collective hallucination, or whether you believe that something was on those maps, and that its absence from the maps that followed is not a correction of historical error, but a continuation of a very deliberate historical project. A project that required the past to be simplified, that required the origin of great wealth to be made to look like nothing, like a boy with a boat on a harbour, so that the far older, far larger, far more consequential origin could remain invisible. Not because the truth was impossible to find, but because the story told in its place was one that the people who benefited from the truth were very, very good at telling. The Vanderbilts told that story better than almost anyone, and for 150 years most of us believed it.